Hello and welcome to this video on the Roman gladiator and whether they were glorified cannon fodder fit into the circus of death and bread, or a prize celebrity who earned fame and prestige through martial might. If we say gladiator, your first thought is probably going to be one of two things, either the Colosseum in Rome, or alternatively the Russell Crowe movie. And now both of these technically become the same thing at one point, but we'll ignore that for now. The issue with gladiators are that they basically arose from Etruscan funeral rites somewhere in the 4th to 3rd century BCE. They were basically prisoners forced to fight to honour the deceased, which is a rather new form of wake. Not quite the coffin dance, but we suppose it's getting closer. The Romans later adopted this, as they adopted many other things from the Etruscans, and adapted the practice to suit their own needs. The first recorded gladiatorial games were somewhere around 264 BCE. They were hosted by Decimus Junius Brutus, to commemorate his father's death, so they haven't really changed much from their initial purpose. They were initially just private events though. These events eventually became public spectacles under the state control by the 1st century BCE. In case the dating system we're using is confusing you, BCE is essentially BC and, CE or Common Era is the equivalent of AD, if that's what you're all used to hearing. Now, under the 1st century Roman rule, the late Republic, we basically have these Colosseum-type fighters. The gladiators were part of Rome's broader culture of having public entertainment alongside things like chariot races, theatre performances, and so on, along with giving out copious amounts of free bread. The games had a number of purposes. They obviously reinforced that Rome was powerful and mighty, and look at the people they're bringing in via war. And of course the demonstration of violence allowed for a certain amount of controlled outlet of cultural violence. And of course the emperors and elites were able to display their wealth and power by having some poor sods fight to the death. By the imperial period, roughly 27 BCE to 476 CE, gladiators, just engaged in contests where there were massive state-sponsored events. Kind of like, say, massive grand final matches in various football events, whether it's American football, soccer football, or any other kind of football you happen to know of. They were generally associated with, let's say, or tied into some sort of political agenda. For example, celebrating a major military victory, or trying to prevent a coup, revolution, or similar by the masses. The types of gladiators varied, but they were categorized by the kind of weapons, armor, and, to a certain extent, diversity of spectacle that they were expected to perform. There are some key types. We have the retiarius, who fought with a trident, net, and dagger, wearing minimal armor, typically only a shoulder guard or galerius and arm protection. The retiarius relied on speed. The secator, which is a heavily armored gladiator, who had a smooth helmet, a large shield, and a short sword. They were intended to counter the retiarius with their helmet, and thereby avoid the issue of being caught by the net. The murmillo, who had a crested helmet, resembling a fish, and they carried a large rectangular shield, and a gladius. They were versatile and basically a jack of all trades. The thrakes, who had a curved sword and a small rectangular shield, and they had a helmet with a griffin crest. Their mobility made them somewhat more capable of dealing with heavier opponents. Your sort of rock, paper, scissors scenario for most video games, if you're more familiar with that. The hoplomachus, which was basically a hoplite, except slightly different, in that they had a spear, a dagger, and a small round shield, along with a helmet and greaves. They had a sort of balance of everything. And then we had the equus, which were, given the name, you could kind of tell, but mounted gladiators who fought on horseback and had lances. They also, later on, if their horse was taken out from underneath them, dismounted to fight with swords, but they typically only had light armor. The actual Roman gladiator themselves, other than being in these archetypes, were actually rather complex figures. Typically speaking, they were slaves, but also celebrities. They were warriors, yet entertainers. The dichotomy of their role in Roman society is really weird, and it reveals something of a, let's say, a culture obsessed with not just spectacle, power, and control, but also capable of admiring skill and bravery in, let's say, certain circumstances. In the wrong circumstances, you'd wind up hung on a couple of 2x4s and lining the Apennine Way.
God, I just hate slavery so much. Slavery's the worst. If I could go back in time and undo slavery, I would.
The arenas were generally staged for both Rome's grandeur and to meet the contradictions we're talking about. And this is something that's continued to captivate people until today, given the sheer complicated diversity of everything the Colosseum in Rome could do. whether it's going to be, say, a giant naval arena, or it's going to be a giant sandpit. You could basically have the complete extremes of everything. There were also gladiators who weren't so, let's say, named after their role rather than the nature of their loadout. The provocateur was basically someone who, provocates, just like in an MMO, RPG, or similar sort of game. The bestiarius was someone who fought with animals particularly, and, they weren't always considered true gladiators, but they fit into the, let's say, a larger body of, gladiators, let's say. There are also a couple of less common types we need to talk about, although these are more, again, spectacle rather than common. We had the andbatter, basically blindfolded individuals or those who had restricted vision, the dimacharius, who had dual-wielded swords, and just about every one of these people was going to be matched up against someone to try and balance both the spectacle and the fairness. They even had referees, the summa rudis, and these were to ensure that rules were followed. And it does tell you that this was a rather regulated event, surprisingly. The recruitment, and to a lesser extent social status of gladiators, is somewhat more difficult to explain, mostly because they were typically drawn from what are considered marginalized groups today, effectively slaves and prisoners of war. It was essentially, did you lose a fight with a Roman? Great, now you have a good chance of becoming a gladiator. Or possibly becoming just a slave. Yeah, it's not great. But the majority of gladiators were enslaved individuals, and they were generally captives from Rome's conquests, so Gaul, Thrace. If you're really unlucky, you might well be a Carthaginian, but, things get, let's say, complicated as we go through history, and it obviously will vary a lot based on where and what Rome was conquering at the time. Even defeated enemies like Spartacus, basically became what we can best describe as celebrities in the arena. Sometimes, though, you just didn't have anyone available because Rome wasn't busy conquering things or was busy trying to keep barbarians out. In this case, you're out of people to get from elsewhere, so go down to the local jail and see if you can't round up a handful of the usual. And that was what they did. They would take condemned prisoners who would be sentenced to fight as gladiators, or they would die. Either way, they're going to the arena, it's just whether or not they had any hope of leaving. And the hope they did have of leaving was fairly minimal, as they often went into the arena with practically no training, and therefore survival was, not particularly great. The, free volunteers were individually more surprising. These were also called the octorati, and they are free Romans. Sometimes individuals who were just really damn poor, and even women who became gladiators in order to get fame, money, and social mobility. To a certain extent, however, by the 1st century, basically Rome decided, this is not okay, we don't want this happening anymore, and laws prevented free citizens from doing so, mostly to ensure that Romans remained top of the hierarchy. Despite being such low-status individuals, successful gladiators could achieve a degree of celebrity-like status. You see this in the movie Gladiator. The lead role essentially becomes a major social figure, and it's why the emperor gets so pissy about it. Their images basically became idolized, they were put on lamps, mosaics, and even graffiti, just like today with celebrities. It's important to note that getting to the point where they could buy their freedom, though, with that fame, was very unlikely. Some did achieve. Then again, just about all of them died young, so, it's a rare event. Female gladiators did exist, and they were called gladiatrices, just like, say, a dominatrix, just with gladiator. Again, though, very rare, and basically sensationalized. By the time it got around to 200 CE, they were basically banned, though, which meant that, it was gone. It was a relatively short-lived, interesting phenomena, like Twitch thoughts. Gladiators were trained in specialized schools called ludus. The singular is ludus, the plural is ludi. This was run by a lanista, a manager who owned all these gladiators out to coliseums. Again, very much like what we see with Gladiator the movie, although again somewhat different and more somewhat akin to what we see with the old Spartacus movie. The initial training was with wooden weapons, mostly to avoid injury, just like today with training with any sport, but unlike today, they gradually moved on to real weapons. The life in the ludus was fairly well disciplined, but to an extent we wouldn't argue it was brutal. Think of it as more like a boot camp for the army in a way, in that, yes, it's very strict, it's very hard, but if you do what you're meant to do, you'll be treated reasonably well. Gladiators would receive medical care, a very high-protein diet, which for the time was somewhat, let's say, unusual. and the structured routine meant that they were always in the best of physical health. Interestingly though, although we say they had a high protein diet, although a significant portion came from meat, significantly more came from things like beans and barley. Despite all this, and despite the great treatment, the gladiator was still someone's property, and so if they didn't do what they were supposed to do in one manner or another, punishments, were harsh, ranging from simply being beaten all the way to death, more so the latter in the case of rebellion. The ludus was, for all intents and purposes, a microcosm of Roman hierarchy, and the better the skilled gladiator was, the better their earning privileges were likely to be. And because they earned more money, they got better living conditions, better quarters, and some may even get a degree of freedom. There were sometimes larger events called munera. These literally meant duty or gift in the ancient Roman language, or ludi, public games, and these day events were basically a structured program where you'd have something in the morning like an animal hunt, and then the execution of criminals, typically either those who are politically unwanted, those who committed actual legal crimes, or those who come in from other jurisdictions after Rome conquered it, and they needed to execute them very publicly. And, eventually they went on to things like staged mythological reenactments. By midday, novelty acts, so let's say comedies, we have dwarven women, or dwarves full stop in some cases, and then in the afternoon you had the main gladiatorial fights, which really is relatively similar to today, where the main act is generally towards the end. Now, fights were not always to the death, and we need to be clear about this. There was a notable transition over time where gladiators were increasingly subjected to the ultimate penalty of death for losing, but this is not really true at the start. Contrary to popular belief, a skilled gladiator was incredibly valuable, and promoters would rather keep them alive because they would keep earning money. For a very crass analogy, I think of them as being like a pimp and their hoe. The hoe wants to keep the pimp working because, they don't get money if they're not working. But if they kill them, they'll set an example, but, that example doesn't get them any money. The same idea, just that in this case, the hoe is a gladiator with a very big weapon and very strong versus the pimp who is possibly an old Roman official who probably couldn't put up much of a fight by themselves. Now, there is the whole thing about a gladiator appealing for mercy by raising a finger, and the crowd or presiding official could decide the fate. This is somewhere the thumbs up, thumbs down thing is a rather modern myth, though. It's basically, it's been somewhat debated, but the actual language makes clear that it's a myth. It sounds cool, but what we see is complete bullshit. There are, however, things that aren't bullshit, and, for example, we have the arenas. The Roman Colosseum, as we mentioned, is an architectural marvel, but it is not the only one by a long shot. Just about all Colosseums can be found in many different places, and they all have many of the same features, just on different scales. Trapdoors, elevators, flooded stages, everything you could possibly want in order to be able to see a spectacle. And spectators, from senators to plebs, would pack into here, with attendance generally being free but not always, but it was basically a major public figure paying for the event, whether it is literally the government or ruling body, or some sort of a major public figure being a patron. And they did so, partly for goodwill, essentially, look at me, aren't I a great person because I'm letting you see this awesome event, and in other cases it was, an attempt to ensure the public was more occupied by the awesome event, and less with the actual problems they were facing. The gladiator games were more than entertainment though. They were, to an extent, tools of control. For example, you can use them for propaganda. Emperors like Augustus and Nero used the games to showcase Rome's power, reenacting the victories they had, and in other cases using them to literally distribute food and gifts to ensure the populace didn't get too unhappy with them. This did reinforce the Roman hierarchy and ensure that there was always a degree of social order. It always showed that, look, we are Rome, we are wonderful, but we're not one of those barbarian groups that are out there, or in other cases, literally showing, hey look, we are civilized, but those other people, they're criminals, and therefore Rome is superior. The morality of it is, highly debatable, but to be blunt about it, in the modern sense, it's terrible. In the sense of time when this was a thing, kind of necessary, and you can't really say that morality from today applies then exactly. It's, let's say controlled brutality, and therefore doing this required a certain amount of courage to look like a monster, but also show that you had the power to be a monster, but weren't. The games reflect Rome's very complex relationship with violence. To be clear about it, Rome was very violent, but also not violent at the same time. Gladiators had the, shame, let's say, of being an outcast, typically a slave, but also the honor, at least supposed honor, of being highly skilled warriors. This meant they mirrored the Roman ideal of virtue, that is basically the manly skills. Now, we have mentioned already that the gladiatorial games and gladiators did decline over time, and there is a good reason for this. The actual, gladiator as an idea and person peaked between the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, but by the 4th century, they basically had almost completely fallen out of favour and they became a non-thing. A part of this is the spread of Christianity, and part of it is basically Rome ran out of resources to do this. For example, Emperor Constantine I banned some of the forms of gladiatorial combat in 325 CE. However, he kept things like animal hunts, showing the, obviously, ability to not only source animals, but show a degree of controlled violence against a non-person. The last recorded gladiatorial fights or contests were sometime around 404 CE, with Emperor Honorius officially ending them under the effect of Christianity. The legacy has continued to the modern day, and obviously we have a variety of films. Archaeology continues to find places like colosseums and gladiatorial cemeteries, even things like diets, injuries, and so on, and the term gladiator has come to have certain symbolic meaning. Now, we've mentioned to an extent the fact that gladiators were typically slaves, prisoners of war, and similar. And we've also mentioned that, to some extent, they could become extremely successful, achieving fame and wealth. And this was something of a paradox. Helleniste, these were gladiator trainers or owners, and the various sponsors invested into them to maximize their ability to not only perform well, but to generate a profit. That last part being true in the Roman era as much as it is today, so capitalism has been a thing for a very long time. However, gladiators were still expendable. To be clear about it, we're not saying that they were trying to keep them alive at all possible costs. There was a cost versus benefit analysis done. The level of care would vary a lot based on the individual status, skill, and the resources of the ludus or the school they were in. Death was unfortunately a real risk, and, not really unfortunately, it was a very obvious risk. And not the kind of risk you see in Gladiator where your heads explode and similar because you have an angry Roman general. No. It was risk because of a variety of factors. That's sort of part of it, but that's a very unrealistic depiction. Death, however, was not the default outcome. The longer a fighter would continue on fighting in the gladiatorial arenas, the more skilled they were, and the more economically advantaged it became to keep them alive. So gladiators were, as said, fed a very specialized diet. This was meant to maintain strength and stamina. It's high calorie, high carbohydrate, and protein rich. Archaeological evidence and various texts from the time describe their diet as being that's rich in barley and beans, oats, and meat. This also gives them a nickname known as fodder or barley men. Barley being a staple due to both being very affordable and very energy intensive. This is one reason why beer was used to build the pyramids. It was made from barley, and barley therefore gave them lots of sugar. Stable isotopes from gladiatorial skeletons found in the cemetery at Ephesus show that they had a very high level of plant-based proteins, and there was even some calcium supplementation, solely from some sort of bone broth. Basically, get them big, get them strong, and make them fight well. And it also, to a certain extent, meant that if they had a nice layer of fat, any superficial wounds would give them lots of scarring, but not actually be anything that would damage their muscles. There's some resources that suggest that gladiators may have also consumed various calcium-rich concoctions, maybe something like ash mixed with water or even wine, to help with their bones. The diet was very much functional and, to be blunt about it, it's a feast compared to that of the average slave or even the urban poor. This is one reason why bread and circuses is an expression. The government of Rome at the time had to give away bread in order to keep people happy, and circuses is, part of it is literally these gladiatorial fights, other times it's the various other performances we've described. The chances of surviving, therefore, were significantly higher because you were well fed as a gladiator, but it was also a relatively boring meal. Basically, it was intended to keep them fed and healthy, not necessarily enjoying their food. Something they did enjoy, more so than the average person, was medical care. The care gladiators received was very advanced for the time, and this reflects the aforementioned issue of them being very valuable as an asset. Understand, Roman medicine was built sort of on Greek medicine practices, but also developed some of their own things, and it was very advanced for that time in a very broad sense. Most of the rest of the world didn't really have a great idea about what was going on. The Romans more advanced in those terms. And so each ludi would often have their own dedicated physician or doctor on hand, and they were involved not only in treating the wounds that they'd receive in a fight or training, but also things like fractures and even infections. Galen, one of the more famous physicians, began his career treating gladiators in Pergamon, and he described various techniques like setting bones and suturing wounds. Now, injury management is also shown in the archaeological record with a very wide body of evidence showing that gladiators who were ultimately dead, buried in cemeteries, had a lot of intervention done on them, whether it healed fractures or signs of surgery and even trepanation, drilling a hole into someone's head. There is basically no skeleton without at least some sign of a medical professional getting involved in their care, and that just that every wound was treated. Now, whether or not they treated to ensure recovery or just tried to minimize suffering before death, well, that's a different matter entirely. Successful gladiators in a fight were very much given time to heal between fights because this would again preserve their value. Simply put, if you come back from a fight injured and die, all that money's gone. But if they keep you out of the fight for a little while and you go back and you can keep on fighting, you keep generating money. It's a very different approach to what Amazon has with, say, warehouse workers or delivery truck drivers, mostly because we've yet to see anything about gladiators having to pee into bottles. The care for gladiators was exceptional for what slaves received at that time. To be clear about it, soldiers wouldn't even get this level of care, or even some elites. And it wasn't due to altruism or pragmatism. Simply put, the longer a gladiator fought, the more money they generated, the more money they got back for their investment into that gladiator.
We're not just doing this for money. We're doing it for a shitload of money.
But not everybody was so lucky. The Noxai, or those who were criminals who'd basically roped into this because, well, they had no gladiators to speak of available at the time, received basically no medical care. They were told to tough it out, and this is why they often died. In terms of facilities, well, gladiators actually had much better living conditions than most people try and rent today. Whilst, yes, the accommodations in their barracks were often small and typically shared, they were still quite comfortable for what they were. They were cramped but functional. They had access to all the training grounds they required, baths, kitchens, and elite gladiators may even have had private rooms or, to a lesser extent, better amenities, although as a slave, better amenities is something of a misnomer, we'd say. But still, compared to your modern, say, university student, or even postgraduate, say a PhD or a postdoc, their living conditions were better. Same conditions as a slave, but different reasons. In terms of discipline and security, well, the Ludus or gladiator schools were heavily guarded. Kind of obvious when you have a whole bunch of trained warriors who may or may not suddenly think that their life has more meaning outside of the walls. And this became more pronounced after Spartacus' rebellion in 73 to 71 BCE. Basically, gladiators were closely monitored and, well, they were typically chained or locked into their cells, and more so if they were particularly rebellious. If they were particularly successful, well, again, they would get perks. Better food, occasional freedom, and occasionally, concubines, but in a more modern term, you might be more familiar with the word prostitute. And a graffiti from Pompeii would suggest that some gladiators had trusts outside of their approved list, let's call it. Basically, they were celebrities, just like, say, music stars and similar today, except, well, rather more violent. Well, no, actually. Considering how some of the musicians are like, probably not that much more violent. Anyway, as we mentioned, living conditions, while it's not luxurious, were massively improved over what slaves would receive, and you could even argue superior to what some of the poorer, free people would receive. And part of this was simply to give security, because, well, the people running the ludus did not want the gladiators escaping. Now, the training was obviously necessary. You can't just throw a random unskilled individual into combat and expect them to do well. Well, you can, but don't expect them to survive. In order to ensure that your average gladiator was capable of performing, assuming they're not the Noxai, they were trained daily, starting in the early morning right through to evening, and they would keep on going. The physical training was generally on the specified kind of gladiator they were, so they get specialized training for their particular kind of loadout. And of course, well, gladiators were essentially mentally prepared to face death because you kind of have to be in this scenario. Training was intensive and it was done by professionals, and this again reflects the fact that they are valuable individuals. Admittedly, there's a change in perception of slaves over time, but the general view is that yes, although a slave is without most of their rights in the more recent history, they were still an investment. You didn't want them just dying on you. You kind of wanted them to keep going on because you don't get your money back if they die. The notion that gladiators were disposable in that same way is only a partial misconception. Death was obviously a constant risk because, again, you are facing somebody who could swing their sword or their spear in the wrong way and suddenly you can't be resuscitated. But of course, well, with a skilled gladiator costing thousands of sesterces, which is the equivalent of an annual soldier's pay, well, you wanted to maximize the return on this investment by keeping them alive for as many fights as possible. Understand, the annual pay for a soldier, if you have a rough approximation in your particular locality, is what it would cost to buy one of these people, and you would still need to feed them, house them, train them, and everything else before you could even start to see a vague return on your expense. So estimates on most historical records and skeletons suggest that roughly 10 to 20% of the fights would end in a death, and this is often due to the choice of clemency, mostly due to the referees, and sometimes the crowd. The defeated gladiators, if they fought bravely, were more likely to survive the battle. So we have the fact that they're not dying from the fight itself more often than not, and that people want to keep them alive. It meant that the career longevity was just that. The successful gladiators could keep fighting for years. Flamma was reportedly able to survive dozens of fights and earn freedom multiple times. This also explains where a lot of the trainers come into play. Freed gladiators would go on to become the trainers, and sometimes they'd even fight voluntarily as octorati, but the freed gladiators were called ridarii. Sometimes, however, like the Noxai, the condemned criminals, they were meant to die, and, well, if they didn't die from the animals, they could always experience the pointy end of a sword. The death, however, was undeniable. The reality is that skilled gladiators still had to fight other skilled gladiators, and if they got wounded, well, wounds, infection, and sometimes even the crowd demanding for death would simply ensure that they didn't come out of the arena alive. And so, gladiators were generally well cared for, at least compared to other slaves and prisoners, and the care was not so much because they were concerned about their well-being, but utilitarian purposes of, can I get enough money out of this person to justify their purchase? But their diet, medical care, and training would have rivaled just about that of any kind of elite athlete or soldier of the time or today, and to a certain extent would have surpassed the average Roman's access to anything. The status, though, was a major factor. Elite gladiators would get much better care, just as they would today if they were, say, an elite athlete, versus your average running individual who's just pulled out of the pack. So there was a certain hierarchy, especially within the ludus themselves. But, well, there were limits on a gladiator. Not limits in terms of, what they could do, although that is a factor as well, but just limits to how far things could go. So, for example, we couldn't call what happened true welfare. Gladiators were still property, and of course if they denied what they were supposed to be doing, they were still disciplined. Their lives were subordinate to all of the arena's demands, and, well, there was a constant issue with psychological trauma, isolation, and the threat of death, which is enough to drive anyone mad. So yes, they were cared for, but they were cared for in the way that you care for a good tool. A few interesting factors to consider. These fights had to be major things. The Colosseum in Rome could hold 50 to 80,000 spectators. Trajan ran a 117-day celebration in 107 CE, and this required thousands of gladiators and animals. And so, as we mentioned, somewhere between 1 in 10 and 1 in 5 of fights would end in death. So this is much lower than what you would think, and of course, as mentioned, there are a variety of fairly famous gladiators, so they are complex figures. But they were slaves and celebrities, warriors and entertainers, and Their role in Roman society shows that they had a weird culture, mostly obsessed with spectacle, power, and control, but they also were able to show off to an extent. Now, we need to talk about just how much is invested into a gladiator. We've spoken about it in a sort of vicarious manner so far, but understand, your average gladiator is very expensive, not only to train, but maintain. A skilled fighter could cost thousands of sesterces, and their owners, the Lanistae, had to not only sponsor this individual, sort of, but in order to get their interest going, they had to basically put a lot of money in the first place, and then hope that they would get enough interest, kind of like a Twitch thought or a VTuber. So if you lost a gladiator, well, that's all that money gone. You literally buried in the ground. The best care was reserved for only those that were professional gladiators, and typically speaking, only those that had shown success. The level of care would therefore depend on how successful you were, the same way Twitch treats anyone on their platform. The more money you bring them, the less they give a shit about what you actually get up to unless they get social backlash. This is why gladiators had specialized expert care in the form of medicine. Now, Ludi, as mentioned, had dedicated doctors trained in both Greek and Roman medicine, and the renowned physician Galen was an example of this, but they also had assistants and therapists. For example, the physicians were supported by assistants who handled tasks like, say, wound cleaning or preparing medicines, but they also had masseurs, physiotherapists, and more that helped to try and maintain their body and recover after not only training, but battles or fights or whatever you wish to call them. So most of the medical care aligned with the economic goal of keeping the gladiator alive, but doesn't mean they weren't caring for them in that respect. The injuries that were sustained, however, would have come from a range of sources, whether it's animals, the kind of weapon, just training itself. There are a lot of ways this could happen, and some of this is documented through skeletal remains, and others are in ancient texts. And cuts and lacerations are probably the most common, coming from the swords, tridents, and nets used, and these were typically to the limbs or torso, and this is simply due to the weapons used. It's just a reality. You use sharp and pointy objects, you get cuts. There were, however, fractures and dislocations from blunt trauma. Shields and maces were used, and this would lead to broken bones or dislocated joints, and the skeletons support that this is very, very common. And they clearly show that the fractures were healing, indicating they'd been treated properly and well. Much like modern footballers, head trauma is another factor. Helmets would reduce fatal head injuries, but just because you don't die doesn't mean there's not trauma, so concussions and skull fractures were a fairly common thing. Trepanation was used in some cases, if not overly much, and as a result, yes, some people survived this if they had a particular hemorrhage inside their head, but that doesn't mean that it was the right kind of treatment. And of course, any open wound is a risk for infection, and so infection played a major cause of death in antiquity. Basically, they had no antibiotics available, so the best you could hope for was to clean the wound with things like strong wine, which probably is a terrible idea, and various herbs, and hope that this would prevent sepsis, which, yeah, okay, that's an interesting option. But the medical care, compared to what you would get elsewhere, was much better than the average person or even soldiers would get, remembering that the nature of what they're going through is pretty damn traumatic. It is a fight with weapons. It's not like, say, when Tumblr invaded 4chan and 4chan retaliated, or when someone says something mean to you on X. No, they actually had proper wounds, and so depending on the type of wound and how severe it is, they would choose what to do. So for example, in the case of a fairly minor end of this, you'd have cleaning and disinfection. Water, vinegar and wine was done to try and clean the wound as much as possible and prevent infection. They even made sure to use things like, say, linen, which isn't ideal, nor is the use of gut thread, which theoretically it's great because these are strong materials, but also they're, fibers that can carry all sorts of nasties, so not ideal. But the archaeological evidence does show that at least the wounds were sealed or sutured neatly, which is something. Then there's dressing. Things like a lint, wool, or even linen, soaked in things like honey, olive oil, or various herbal mixtures, were used, and some of this is praised as a early antibacterial approach. Yeah, there's issues with this, but it's not entirely wrong. Then we have fractures and dislocations, so fractured bones were realigned, obviously, immobilized, and then splints were used, made from either wood or metal. And, this is the same thing we use today for all intents and purposes. And then you have traction and manipulation. Again, very much what we do today, basically trying to prevent the body from doing anything, especially if it's broken. And again, the evidence from archaeological remains, and particularly skeletons, shows they did the right thing, and it worked. Surgery is a little more advanced because it varies in location and nature of the injury, but as we've said already, trepanation for head injuries was reasonably common, and yes, it does work, and yes, the trepanation holes healed, so it obviously was successful in some cases. But in other instances, well, damage was so severe that surgery really was just amputation. The damage to the limb was so extensive that if you left the limb there, it would turn gangrenous, and it would rot off, and eventually that rot would spread. So you had to have things like scalpels and bone saws, and these are present in other Roman medical kits used throughout the Roman world. And then the wounds were cauterized, which, oof. Cauterization is when you effectively get something hot, let's say a piece of iron or steel, and you heat it up until it's red hot, and then you apply it to the wound and burn it closed. In other cases, you can use chemicals to do the same thing. So, yes. Now, pharmacological treatments, well, there aren't a lot of options at this time. There are various plants that can be used, opium being an example, or willow bark, but these were sort of hit and miss. We've mentioned before issues around opium being somewhat inconsistent and not the most concentrated form of analgesia, and willow bark, as we've described, can be used to get aspirin. You just had your arm chopped off, we don't think an aspirin is going to do the job somehow. And of course, dietary supplementation to help with the healing. And then we have rehabilitation. Obviously, you've just had massive trauma to your body, you want to recover properly. So, you also want to ensure that your gladiator recovers properly so you can get your money out of them. Again, fairly obvious. The ludi also had access to baths, which means the gladiators and various people working within it were very hygienic, let's say. Therefore, clean, well-dressed, everything was where they should be to minimize the possibility of disease spreading, in a city that already had reasonable sanitation. By modern standards, it's okay. By ancient standards, it was a miracle. The ludi themselves had incredibly advanced facilities for what it is. The infirmaries they had, the essentially makeshift hospitals, were spaces that provided access to clean water, the various tools needed, and everything else to deal with someone who's been injured almost immediately. The Romans had fairly advanced toolkits available. Scalpels, probes, forceps, specula, everything needed to make this happen successfully. Of course, how much of this you had access to would again come back to how well you performed. The better you did in terms of the arena, the better the care you would receive, because your laniste was willing to invest more heavily in your care to keep you fighting. This is why novices and noxi got very little care, and the condemned were basically left to die as they were, because, well, that was the intention. Infection was an ever-present and always ongoing risk of concern, and, well, Roman understanding of germ theory wasn't. The economy factors were coming into play, where how much investment would it take to get you back into fighting condition versus how much money were you actually earning. And of course, well, psychological neglect. Physical injuries were typically easily treated, at least in relative terms, but the psychological element, that's not so easily dealt with. And just ask anybody who had a hard time in high school. The trauma from that never really leaves. The outcome and survival rates indicate that, yeah, it was fairly successful. To be clear about it, we really only know about the number of deaths from the fights themselves, where we mentioned about 10 to 20% of the fights would end in the death of one or both of the gladiators. How many of them had injuries and then went on to die? Less so clear. But it would indicate that at least every effort was made, to an extent and with the various caveats mentioned, to ensure that they would keep on going. And these motivations weren't, they certainly weren't altruistic. The more famous, or the more, the more widespread the name of the gladiator, the more likely you would want to keep them going back into fight again. So it made more sense to spend money on that idol. The same way the Japanese idol industry spends lots of money on those young girls, and then proceeds to basically destroy their lives in various ways.
I too want to stand in front of the Emperor. As you did. And listen to me. Learn from me. I wasn't the best because I killed quickly. I was the best because the crowd loved me. Win the crowd, and you'll win your freedom. I will win the crowd. I will give them something they've never seen before.
Roman gladiators were complex, they were weird, and they showed that Rome, although yes, very much interested in the spectacle of the event, was willing to go to effort in the various ways to keep them alive and on fighting, but, on the other hand, only if you are worth it. And this is a contradiction, and it's leaving a legacy that continues to captivate various people until today. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.